latest SMSL headphone amp. Very good looking, nice price, nice connectivity, but how does it sound? Okay, so let's talk about the amp. This is SH-8s, recently released. It's $230, I think, US dollars. And on paper, everything looks great. It has a lot of power. I'll put that on the screen. Everything is made out of aluminum. It feels nice and sturdy. This one is actually meant to pair with, just a moment, SU-8s DAC. You see, they make a great stack. But I didn't review them together because I really think there's too much to say in one video about both of them, especially because they have slightly different tonalities, and I wanted to review them separately, not as a whole. But I'll talk about pairing a little bit later in the video, how they work as a stack, and about some other pairings also. But for now, let's start with the connectivity part. On the back, it's really simple. It's just a headphone amplifier. It doesn't have integrated DAC. It just has analog inputs, meaning RCA single-ended ones and balanced XLRs. So you have to connect it to some DAC. In the front, again, quite simple. There is no display. We don't really need one when it comes to headphone amplifiers. There is a volume knob. It feels nice, smooth, nothing to complain there. Two headphone outputs. One is single-ended, 6.35 millimeters. The other one is balanced XLR. Important thing to say is that this is not a fully balanced, that means differential amp by design. So you will not gain much by using this balanced output. It's just there for convenience. If you already have this type of jack on your headphones, you can use it, but you will not gain much by doing that over the single-ended output. Here in the middle you can see three switches. The first one is off and on, of course. The second one is choosing between RCA and XLR inputs. And the third one is choosing a gain. You again have two of these, low and high. So all that said, it's time to actually talk about how does this amp really sound. Well, my first impression, it has quite bright tonality, meaning that high frequencies are well extended and everything sounds airy and spacious, but it is quite a bit bright. When it comes to the mid-range, again, it's very revealing, detailed. It's not harsh sounding in any way, it's not like sharp or grainy, but it is again tilted slightly to a brighter and leaner tonality of things. And lastly, the bass line. And the bass line is actually not lean or bright or dry in any way. It's just a normal, quite nice, deep and full sounding bass line, which is good. It gives like the counterweight to that brighter up top, helping this amp to not sound too lean or too analytical. Now, this type of voicing and this type of tonality has its perks and its downsides. For example, some of the perks are that everything you're listening and that is recorded in a natural space with some room acoustics, room atmosphere, and small tiny echoes and the impression of air around instruments will feel lit with this amp. You will hear a lot of that air, a lot of that atmosphere. So the sound stage will feel wide and spacious. That's a really nice thing about it. The downside is that you have to be a little bit careful when pairing it. For example, if you're already using a very bright headphones, something that has that famous spike in the upper mid-range, like Bayer Dynamics headphones, for example. Paired with this amp, that will probably sound too bright and too tacky in these upper parts. Paired with something darker and more tame, it might bring just the right amount of everything. The same thing goes when we are talking about the sources. For example, I first tried it with its intended partner, which is actually SMSL SH-8s, a DAC that's intended to be paired with this head amp. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't really like that pairing all that much. And because of that, I've decided I will not review this as a stack, but as each component separately. So what's happening here? SU8S is a snappy sounding Sabre deck, which means it's highly detailed, revealing, but it puts emphasis on transience and on speed and on quickness rather than tone fullness and lushness, that tone timbre. When you pair that with a bright sounding amp, very open sounding amp, you get something that's, in my opinion, a little bit too bright. It puts too much of the emphasis on these upper parts of the spectrum. And female vocals sound unnaturally lean and bright to my ears. So instead of doing that, I actually much preferred using this amp with a topping D30 Pro DAC, because this one has fuller, warmer bassline. It's also more relaxed and softer when it comes to transients. It's more tame up top. It still offers respectable amount of details and width and soundstage, everything, but it's just more tame and less edgy, and that suits this SMSL head amp really well. So in my opinion, you shouldn't always be a stickler to the rules, and you shouldn't always believe that something that factory paired is the best solution for you. It might be for somebody else that likes that bright and open sound. Maybe that somebody else has a dark, tame sounding headphones. It needs to give them a kick, to give them some zest and oomph in that upper section to make them sound alive. But for most of you with neutral, too brightish sounding headphones, and I think that most headphones on the market are tuned that way to give you that sparkle and that liveliness in the upper registers, I don't believe that SMSL stack is the best way to go. This one, that actually looks very nice too, they're of a similar size, similar look, just clicks better in terms of tonality, in my opinion. It's just my opinion, of course, you don't have to follow it. Also, pairing this one with my own Denafrips RS2 proved to be a really good combination, because that one also prioritizes tone timbre and fullness and richness of tone instead of edges and transients, and that combined really well with this amp. And now we are actually moving to few comparisons. Now the first one that I did is I compared this 230 amp to 140 topping L30. And what I noticed is that SMSL SU8s definitely resolves more details. That especially goes when we are talking about these upper registers. It's just more lit, there's more air, more atmosphere, it sounds wider and bigger. I think that SMSL SU9S would actually be a good competition to topping A50S in balanced mode, because from what I remember, A50S sounds just a little bit better than L30 when it comes to the single-ended output. But it sounds much more composed and revealing and spacious when you actually use its balanced output. So I think that would be a really nice direct competition, but unfortunately I do not have A50s with me anymore. So instead of that, I also compared it to topping A30 Pro, which is admittedly more expensive at $350, and these two definitely have different tonality. SMSL is brighter, more open, more airy, while topping A30 Pro is somewhat more tame when it comes to the highest frequencies. But the things actually change when we start going down the frequency spectrum. For example, if we are talking about the mid-range, like lower mid-range, A30 Pro actually sounds a little bit richer. It can dig more tone texture. And same thing is happening if we are talking about the bass line. A30 Pro has more control. Bass is firmer. It's more disciplined. It's a little bit softer and more loose on the SMSL, and it cannot show you the same amount of inner tone texture as A30 Pro can. So the overall impression is that A30 Pro has more grip, more control, more strident sound, but at the same time, it's not as bright, it's not as airy up top. SMSL is a little bit softer in the bass line, a little bit less authoritative when it comes to controlling the bass and the energetic edges. But in general, I do feel that A30 Pro is more capable, more driven sounding amp. So all that is left for me to say is to make a conclusion here. Well, basically, this is a really nice, really decent sounding head amp. It has its own character, and that character is that it's brighter. It sounds open and airy because of that, but it's definitely a brighter sounding amp. Because of that, you have to take a little bit of care with pairing. And in my personal opinion, the SMSL SH-8s, the DAC that is intended for this amp to be paired with, is not that great after all. Instead of that, I would much rather pair it with a little bit fuller and sweeter sounding DAC, a little tamer sounding DAC, such as topping D30 Pro, for example. And they also look nice together. It's also a really nice looking stack. You don't have to worry about that if aesthetics is what you're worrying about. In terms of its value, I also feel that SMSL nailed that pretty good, because it's definitely a step up from something like topping L30, for example, but I didn't feel that it's as good as topping A30 Pro. So that said, I think that asking price for it, which is $229, I believe, if I'm correct, is like really well judged. It's a very capable amp that justifies its price. You just have to think about, do you like the tonality that I've described? Do you like brighter, airier, more open sounding amp, or are you maybe looking for something else? So if your personal taste and the rest of your equipment, like a DAC, headphones, would match nicely with this kind of brighter, more open sounding amp, then I have no problems recommending it. If not, if you have any piece of gear that is already quite bright, then think about it twice before purchasing it. And with that said, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, click that button, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future reviews like this one, and you can maybe also consider becoming a patron and support this kind of honest, unbiased reviews. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye!